I remember the first time I saw them. Grapes. Hanging just out of reach, glistening in the golden light of the late afternoon. The kind of sight that stirs something inside you, not merely hunger but longing. They weren't just fruit, they were symbols. Symbols of everything I had ever wanted and believed was just beyond my grasp. As I stood there beneath the vine, I realized something strange. It wasn't merely appetite that drove me forward. It was the idea of possession. The thought that once I had them, I would be whole, fulfilled, perhaps even admired. Sigmund Freud once said, "From error to error, one discovers the entire truth." At that moment, I didn't know that my pursuit of those grapes would expose not just my hunger, but the errors of my mind, the hidden ways I lied to myself to preserve my fragile pride. I leapt. The ground beneath me strained under the effort of my muscles. For a brief second, I believed I could reach them, but I didn't. The grapes remained where they were, silent, untouchable. I landed with dull thud, my chest heaving, my pride slightly bruised but not yet broken. "Try again," I whispered to myself. And I did, again and again. Each time the distance mocked me. Each time the grapes seemed higher, though I knew they were not. It's a peculiar thing, this dance between desire and failure. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In chasing those grapes, I thought I was chasing something external. But in truth, I was wrestling with something far more internal. The unconscious belief that my worth was tied to what I could acquire. After the fourth or fifth attempt, sweat trickling down my fur, I sat down, and that's when the whispering began, not from the grapes, of course, but from within. A voice said, "Maybe they're sour anyway." It startled me. Why would I say that? I had never tasted them, never known their sweetness. But already my mind was weaving a story, a defense, a shield. Leon Festinger, the father of cognitive dissonance, once explained, "If you change your behavior, but cannot change your outcome, you will change your belief." And there I was, mid-transformation, my mind reshaping reality to protect my fragile ego. I didn't understand it then, but I was witnessing the birth of self-deception. The grapes still hung above me, but they no longer looked the same. My longing was souring, even as my pride whispered, "You didn't really want them anyway." But deep down, I knew I had. After I convinced myself the grapes were sour, I walked away, but their image lingered in my mind. It was as though my psyche had taken a photograph of them and refused to release it. Even in retreat, I was still thinking about them, still calculating, still yearning. The grapes had become more than fruit. They had become a mirror of my desires and my limitations. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." In the space between my longing and my rationalization, I realized I had made a choice to protect my pride instead of confronting my failure. That choice had freed me in one sense, but it also chained me to an illusion. I noticed something peculiar. My mind was creative, almost theatrical, in rewriting the story. They weren't really worth it, I told myself. Anyone with sense would have ignored them. I felt a strange relief, but it was fleeting. Each time I repeated this mantra, I sensed the quiet itch of envy, the subtle sting of disappointment that I could not quite name. This internal conflict fascinated me. Sigmund Freud would have called it an ego defense mechanism, the mind's way of preserving self-esteem in the face of failure. My unconscious was already at work, twisting perception to protect the fragile structure I had built around my sense of worth. The grapes themselves were innocent. My mind had weaponized them. And yet, a small, persistent part of me could not be fooled. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the vibrant sheen of the fruit, their quiet, unyielding presence. They were there, untouchable, and I was aware that my rationalizations were a thin veil over something deeper, a fear of inadequacy. Carl Jung once said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." I began to understand that my envy, my bitterness, was not merely about the grapes. It was about my own insecurities. I had projected them onto an object that could neither satisfy nor reject me. Yet in my mind, it had the power to define my worth. I started to see patterns. Friends and acquaintances in my life, colleagues, even strangers online, all wrestle with their own invisible grapes. How many times had they dismissed a missed opportunity, a promotion, a relationship, telling themselves it wasn't worth it while secretly seething with envy? Cognitive dissonance is not limited to fables. It lives in every corner of human behavior. I walked through the forest that day, replaying the scene in my mind. Each leap, each failure, each whispered excuse was a lesson in psychology I hadn't expected to learn so vividly. I felt both foolish and enlightened. There was an irony that made me smile bitterly. In pretending not to care, I cared more than ever. And then I paused. I thought about Nietzsche's words. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. My abyss was not the grapes themselves, but the reflection of my own desire, my own envy, my own self-deception. I was fighting a monster I had carried inside all along. It occurred to me that envy is subtle, almost invisible. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, nudges, twists perception so skillfully that you don't even notice a distortion until you look back. The grapes, in their silence, were teachers, cruel ones, perhaps, but honest in their immutability. By the end of that day, I realized that the true lesson had little to do with grapes at all. It was about how we see ourselves, how we deceive ourselves, and how easily pride can transform desire into bitterness. My mind had conjured reasons, excuses, even a moral framework to explain my failure. And in doing so, I had glimpsed a fundamental truth. Human beings will bend reality to protect their ego before confronting reality itself. As twilight descended, I left the clearing. The grapes were still there, hanging, indifferent, eternal. And though I walked away, I carry a fragment of understanding. That envy, rationalization, and self-deception are not flaws to be ashamed of, but shadows to be acknowledged. Days passed, yet the grapes haunted me, not as tangible fruit, but as a symbol of what I could not attain. At first, I had dismissed them as sour, but now a subtle bitterness had settled deep within me, a quiet poison that seeped into my thoughts. I began noticing it in my reactions to others. When friends spoke of successes or achievements, I felt a small, unacknowledged sting. It was never rage, not yet, but a whispering envy that colored perception. They must have had it easier, I thought. It wasn't about skill or effort. And just like that, the mind reshapes reality, casting shadows over joy in others to soothe its own inadequacies. This, I realized, was not just a story about grapes. It was about the mechanisms by which we preserve the self when faced with failure. Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance became alive before me. When the mind cannot change the outcome, the grapes remain beyond reach. It changes a belief. The grapes were sour, my mind insisted, while the envy whispered quietly beneath. Freud might have called this an ego defense, Jung a shadow rising, Viktor Frankl the confrontation with meaninglessness. All pointed to the same truth. Humans are exquisitely skilled at bending perception to protect fragile self-esteem. And yet, beneath this skill, there's always a cost. The bitterness that lingers, the energy wasted in rationalization, the silent erosion of trust and joy. These are the tolls we pay when we refuse to meet reality honestly. I remember a moment when I saw a bird, plump and bright, feasting on berries freely hanging from a nearby bush. A pang of desire hit me. But unlike the grapes, this fruit was accessible. And yet, I realized my mind could not enjoy it. My envy of the unreachable fruit had spilled over, tainting the sweetness of what was actually within grasp. How strange, I thought, that the mind can turn abundance into scarcity simply by dwelling on what it cannot have. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." I had not yet made my darkness conscious. I saw my envy as a small inconvenience, a fleeting thought. But now I recognize it as a shadow, quietly dictating my judgments, my reactions, and even my self-image. The bitterness was no longer external. It was embedded within. And then came the projection, without realizing it. I began seeing flaws and imperfections in those who possessed what I desired. My friends' successes were not just achievements. They became proofs of my own inadequacy. Nietzsche's warning echoed in my mind. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. In trying to shield my ego, I had become a subtle predator of perception, attacking others in thought, though never in deed. I wondered how many people live this way daily, their own shadows shaping the lens through which they see the world. How many joys are dimmed not by circumstance, but by the mind's insistence on self-preservation? How many sour grapes do we invent to soothe a fragile pride? By the end of the week, I understood a critical point. Self-deception is seductive because it feels protective. The mind whispers, "You failed, but it's okay. The goal wasn't worth it anyway." And for a moment, it feels true, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it reshapes reality, converting desire into resentment, longing into bitterness. I began writing down my thoughts, as if putting words on paper could exorcise the poison. Each sentence forced me to confront the quiet envy, to name the distortion. Carl Jung's insight echoed again. Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. I was beginning to look inside, and in doing so, I saw the roots of my self-deception. The grapes remained in my mind's eye, unchanged, untouchable, eternal. And yet, in facing my reaction to them, I began to glimpse a subtle freedom. Not of the fruit, not of my desire, but freedom from the tyranny of my own rationalizations. The bitterness remained, but now it was a teacher, a mirror, not a shackle. The days after I acknowledged my envy were strange. I still thought of the grapes, but now I noticed how much of my energy had been spent on their pursuit, and on convincing myself they weren't worth it. The bitterness had not vanished entirely, but a subtle shift had begun. Where once I had recoiled from the truth, I was now leaning into it, examining the roots of my desire and disappointment. Carl Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." I began to understand that my fixation on the grapes was not just about failure. It was about the choices I had unconsciously made. Every rationalization, every whispered excuse was a choice to protect my ego rather than confront reality. And now, for the first time, I could choose differently. I reflected on envy itself. Psychologists have long studied it as a double-edged emotion. It can poison the mind or illuminate the self. In acknowledging my envy, I realized it was not merely a negative feeling, but a guide, pointing to what I valued and what I feared losing. Viktor Frankl might have called this an encounter with meaning, understanding what truly matters by observing what stirs discomfort when denied. I returned to the vineyard that evening, and the grapes hung there, indifferent and eternal. I approached them slowly, as if measuring not my reach but my understanding. The desire was still present, but I could observe it without being consumed by it. For the first time, I saw the illusion I had built around them. The grapes were not the enemy. My mind had been shaping a story in which they determined my worth. This process reminded me of Freud's insight. Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. I realized I had not been honest, not about the depth of my longing, not about the envy that simmered beneath the surface. By naming it, by observing it, I began to untangle the knot of emotions that had controlled me for so long. I began to notice patterns in everyday life. The same impulse that drove me to rationalize my failure over the grapes appeared in many forms. Dismissing the success of colleagues, inventing reasons why opportunities weren't meant for me, or undervaluing experiences I couldn't have. It was a quiet, pervasive mechanism that shaped perception, behavior, and self-worth. Nietzsche's words came to mind. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The chaos of envy, bitterness, and desire had been consuming me, but now it was a medium through which self-awareness could emerge. By facing it, I began to see not a personal flaw, but a universal human tendency, the way the mind bends reality to protect fragile pride. I started experimenting with small acts of conscious choice. When I saw a friend succeed, I consciously allowed myself to feel admiration rather than jealousy. When I wanted something unattainable, I acknowledged the longing without condemning myself. Each action was a step toward reclaiming agency over my emotions, recognizing that the grapes themselves were neutral. The story I told about them determined the quality of my experience. As the sun set behind the vineyard, I stood silently beneath the vines. The grapes still hung, untouchable, a symbol of desire that had once dominated me. But now, I felt a subtle liberation. I could observe without being imprisoned by the narrative my mind had created. I realized that understanding envy, rather than succumbing to it, could transform it from a source of suffering into a mirror of self-knowledge. In that quiet moment, I reflected on the teachings of Jung and Frankl, on the wisdom of psychologists who had studied human perception and emotion. The lesson was clear. The mind will always create stories to protect the ego, but in making the unconscious conscious, in observing without judgment, there is freedom. The grapes remained, unchanged and indifferent. I walked away, not because I no longer desired them, but because I understood that their presence could no longer dictate my inner life. The first steps toward awareness had been taken, and with them, the possibility of true insight into desire, envy, and self-deception. Time passed, and the grapes still hung above me, silent witnesses to my struggle. Yet now my perspective had begun to shift in ways I could hardly have imagined. By observing my own reactions, the envy, the rationalization, the subtle bitterness, I began to see a larger pattern not only myself but in the world around me. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." That terror had once held me captive. My mind had twisted reality to shield me from the painful truth that I desired what I could not have, and in doing so, had judged both myself and others harshly. Recognition of that truth was uncomfortable, but in discomfort, there was clarity. I began to notice how projection had crept into my daily life. Friends who achieved something I could not became objects of subtle envy in my thoughts. I critiqued their methods, their luck, even their intentions, all because my ego needed a scapegoat to justify its failure. Viktor Frankl's insight resonated. When we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The grapes would never come down. The only thing I could change was my perception and response. As I walked through the vineyard, I reflected on these lessons. Every human desire carries within it the risk of distortion, the tendency to twist reality to preserve self-esteem. Cognitive dissonance teaches us that when reality conflicts with our beliefs, the mind finds a way to realign perception. The grapes, unattainable as they were, became a laboratory for observing this process in myself. Nietzsche's words lingered. He was a why to live can bear almost anyhow. What was my why in chasing these grapes? Initially, it was superficial. To acquire, to conquer, to prove worth. But through reflection, I began to glimpse a deeper why. To understand the nature of my desires, to see the mechanisms by which my mind deceives me, and to reclaim the agency over my emotions that envy had once held captive. I realized something profound. Liberation does not require obtaining the object of desire. It does not demand victory over the external world. True liberation comes from understanding the mind's operations, from seeing envy, projection, and rationalization for what they are, and from choosing a response that aligns with conscious values rather than unconscious compulsion. Freud noted that being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. I have begun this exercise, not in pride, but in humility. Every acknowledgement of envy, every recognition of rationalization, was a small victory over the tyranny of self-deception. And in those small victories, a larger transformation took shape. The grapes, hanging silently above, were no longer symbols of failure. They were mirrors of the mind, reflections of human nature. Every unattained desire in life can act as such a mirror, revealing our insecurities, our projections, and our biases. The moment we see these patterns consciously, we step out of the unconscious loop and reclaim our mental freedom. I walked away from the vineyard that evening feeling something new. Not triumph, but peace. Not possession, but awareness. The energy I had wasted on envy, on the distorted perception of reality, was no longer required. I could direct it toward growth, understanding, and connection. The final lesson was subtle yet profound. Life will always place unattainable desires before us. The mind will invent stories to soothe disappointment. The ego will rationalize failure, and envy will whisper in the shadows. But awareness, conscious observation, reflection, and acceptance can transform these forces from chains into guides. The grapes would remain. My longing would remain, perhaps, But the bitterness, the projection, the self-deception, these no longer held power over me. Insight had replaced compulsion. Reflection had replaced reaction. And in that shift, I found a quiet liberation that comes not from possession, but from understanding. It was quiet in the vineyard that morning. The grapes glistened as they always had, indifferent to my presence. I no longer leapt for them. I no longer whispered excuses. I simply observed. And in that observation, I felt a kind of clarity I had never known before. Carl Jung once said, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." I had spent so long looking outward, at the grapes, at others, at the world, believing that fulfillment and worth were external. Now, I understood that true vision comes from looking inward, from acknowledging the shadows of envy, rationalization, and desire. The grapes had been my teacher, though silent and immovable. They forced me to confront my own mind. I saw how often humans construct illusions to shield themselves from failure, how envy warps perception, how rationalization becomes a comfortable prison. Each leap, each failure, each whispered excuse had been a mirror reflecting my deepest vulnerabilities. Viktor Frankl wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." The grapes had remained beyond reach, yet I was free. Free in my mind, free in my choices, free from the compulsions that once bound me. I could not control their position, but I could control my response, and in that control lay my liberation. I thought about envy, the quiet poison that had once seeped into my thoughts. I realize now that envy is not merely a flaw. It is a signal, a teacher. It points to what we value, what we fear losing, what we need to examine within ourselves. The grapes were never a problem. I was. My perceptions, my desires, my unexamined ego. These are the true obstacles. Freud observed, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. I had learned this lesson in the vineyard, in the sweat of my attempts, in the bitterness of my rationalizations. Honesty with oneself is not easy. It requires humility, courage, and the willingness to face the shadows. But in that honesty, there's clarity. I reflected on the simplicity and cruelty of the fable itself. A fox, grapes, unattainable fruit. Yet beneath the simplicity lies a profound mirror of human psychology. Our minds will invent reasons, justify failures, and reshape reality to preserve pride. But the moment we recognize these patterns, the moment we observe our own shadows without judgment, we awaken.